Hi, my name is Connor Riley, and let's be honest here. Your bracket's already busted. You're sick and tired of watching college basketball. So come on in and let's talk some Georgia football as the Bulldogs have wrapped up the first three spring practices of the spring. This is Connor. Hello, everyone, and welcome into another edition of Connor in Coverage. My name is Connor Riley here on this Sunday night. Michigan State just knocked off number 2 seed Marquette to advance to the Sweet 16. We probably won't talk a whole lot about March Madness. My bracket is naturally in shambles. I had Duke winning it all, and needless to say, the Blue Devils let me down as they lost to Tennessee yesterday. But we'll talk about pretty much anything else, mostly related to Georgia football. Obviously, Georgia women's basketball team, I'm sure if you saw earlier today, their season comes to an end. Tough loss against a very talented Iowa team. They've got the best player in the country in Caitlin Clark. No shame in losing there, wrapping up their first season under their new head coach. Real tough weekend for Georgia baseball, getting swept by South Carolina. And coming into it, this was thought to be one of the series where they kind of had to win, given the schedule that they have coming up there ahead. But main attraction here, Georgia football, talking the first week of spring practice. The Bulldogs have completed their first three practices in pads for the first time on Saturday. They had pro day this week. So we learned a whole lot about Georgia. Talked to Kirby Smart twice, talked to a bunch of different players. You're going to hear from a few of them as we break some things down for you, some early insight, what we've learned, what we've heard. And I figure we start with quarterbacks. It's I think the question we're all most interested in learning and figuring out. Obviously, this battle, I think, is pretty clearly going to go into the fall there. Kirby Smart made some news on Tuesday when he spoke, indicating that both Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff are going to get first-team reps. Not included there is Gunnar Stockton, who Kirby Smart cautioned against counting out, and I would agree with that. Gunnar Stockton is going to find a way to factor into this quarterback battle. But I think at the start, it's pretty clearly Carson and Brock ahead of everyone, ahead of Gunnar Stockton in that, and the two of those guys are competing there. I think we all sort of see the writing on the wall. I wrote about this past week at DawgNation. Carson comes in with the advantage given what he had done last year for Georgia as the backup quarterback. He's the more experienced. I think he's a little bit ahead of where Brock Vandagriff is. And while Vandagriff has all the natural talent tools, the experience that Beck has and some of the ups and downs that he's gone through, I think prepare him to be the starting quarterback at Georgia. And it's ultimately going to be up to Brock Vandagriff to not only just make up that ground, but surpass Carson Beck. They're going to want someone to go out there and win that starting quarterback job. And whoever it is very likely going to be taking snaps from our starting center, Sedrick Van Pran, who we got to hear from on Thursday. I thought he had some really interesting things to say. Sedrick is, in my opinion, the best center coming back in college football next season. He's going to be a first-team All-American. Quite frankly, he could have gone to the NFL draft after this past season, but elected to come back. We wrote about it on Friday. Very simple, just felt like he wasn't done with Georgia. And I'm really interested in seeing what he goes about doing and how he goes about impacting this quarterback battle, because whoever steps in behind him is going to have their life made much, much easier by playing with a guy like Sedrick Van Pran. 30 career starts under his name, already an all SEC level player. And a guy who is maybe one of, if not the most important voices on this team. He was a permanent captain for Georgia last year. He's the only one returning for this season. I expect him to be one of the most vocal leaders, a guy that is respected across this team, and not just by the current players, but by former players as well. They know he's going to uphold that Georgia standard. And so we had a chance to talk to him on Thursday, and naturally the quarterback position came up given his working relationship with whoever is going to be replacing him. I think Sedrick, elaborates well, as we'll play here in the clip for you, that you got to make some slight adjustments regardless of who is back there. But he's done this before in 2021 when he was the starting center. Georgia rotated between Stetson Bennett and JT Daniels there at the starting quarterback position. So he's used to rotating between quarterbacks. It's nothing new for him, and he's eager to see who ultimately ends up separating themselves in this quarterback battle between, right now at the top, Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff, but with Gunnar Stockton looming as well.
To be themselves, honestly. I think that's the biggest thing. These are guys that we've all, been around. I've been around. I've taken reps with them at some point. So, honestly, it's nothing new. It's just a matter of making sure that guys are confident to go out there and play their game.
What kind of adjustment do you have to make as a center, having whoever winds up being a new quarterback that's not Stetson after playing with him the last few years?
To be honest, it's not that big of an adjustment. I think everybody's unique, though. Some guys may be louder. Some guys may be taller, shorter. Some guys may have different preferences when it comes to points and different things like that. But it's all about relationships and knowing, who's behind you and who you're dealing with. So honestly, I feel like I have a pretty good relationship with all of those guys. So usually doesn't come up is more so being able to dictate who's who in the heat of the fire.
So you hear Sedrick there talking about the Georgia quarterback battle competition. It's going to continue to unfold. Georgia was in pads for the first time on Saturday. They'll have 3 more practices this week. They'll have a total of 15 this spring. And right now, I would say Carson is still the favorite to win that starting quarterback job. Obviously, the results on G-Day are going to be a very public and front-facing opportunity. But this quarterback competition is going to be going on for a while. I think we're going to talk about it throughout the summer. I know a lot of people are interested in what I think Brock Vandagriff is ultimately going to end up doing. There's the transfer portal window that opens from May 1st through May 15th. Georgia would love to have 3 quarterbacks on scholarship going through the season next year. I think we've seen in the past some of the dangers of just having 2 scholarship guys. And look, if you lose out on this quarterback battle, it's not unheard of for a guy to, the guy in front to get hurt and you step in and play. That's what happened with Stetson Bennett in the 2021 season. You saw last year Bryce Young wasn't able to finish or didn't play in every game for Alabama. Hendon Hooker wasn't able to finish the season there. So in an ultra physical league like the SEC where you're having quarterbacks get hit and take shots, I don't think it's necessarily out of the realm of possibility to suggest that a quarterback might not be able to finish the season. In 2020, Georgia had 3 different starting quarterbacks. The same case was made in 2021. 2017 and 2016, Georgia had multiple starting quarterbacks there. So it is not out of the realm of possibility that whoever wins the job is able to maintain it throughout the course of the season there. There's been times where poor play has led to benchings, as was the case with Stetson Bennett in 2020, although he was injured there as well in the Florida game. But I think this idea that, Carson Beck's going to step in and start and play every game, that's not always the case. And while it was with Jake Fromm in 2019 and it was with Stetson Bennett in 2022, I do think the value of having depth at that quarterback position is going to be very, very important. And if you're able to keep 3 guys on the team, on the roster, engaged, I do think that regardless of who wins the starting quarterback job, I do think that Brock Vandagriff, Carson Beck, and Gunnar Stockton are all good enough to lead Georgia to wins. Obviously, you're going to want to see them improve as none of those guys have made starts in their college careers to this point in time. But I do think that whoever ends up winning this quarterback job for Georgia is going to be more than good enough. And that also stems in part because of what they have around them. And I think Sedrick Van Pran is the perfect example. I think Georgia's probably got the best offensive line coming back in college football next year. Obviously, they have to replace both offensive tackles there. And I do expect them to do that. I think Amarius Mims is an obvious choice to be one of those guys. And I think we'll probably hear later on tonight, as I've got a clip prepared for you guys about who might that other person be. I know a lot of people are eager in Earnest Greene, but don't rule out a certain other offensive tackle option there. At the wide receiver position, you have to like what you have there. Ladd McConkey's back for another season. We're going to talk about Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint a little bit later, who wowed at Pro Day. Arian Smith, if he's able to stay healthy, I think can absolutely be a difference maker for this team. And then you bring in guys like Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovett to help supplant some of the issues you've had at wide receiver in recent years. Oh, by the way, you also have the best tight end and maybe even the best individual player in the country in Brock Bowers there as well. So there's plenty of talent there on the offensive side of the ball. I think Sedrick provides some good insight and some good, I'm trying to think of the proper word here, some good perspective on the quarterback battle in terms of what it might ultimately be like and why, yes, everyone has the person they want to necessarily see win. Whoever ultimately ends up stepping in there at that quarterback position is going to be plenty good enough for Georgia to ultimately win a potential 3rd straight national championship. So off the top there, we've got Sedrick Van Pran talking about the quarterback battle there and what that ultimately entails and how it's going to look. As we mentioned before, Kirby Smart said that it will be Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff taking reps with the ones. I'll be interested in seeing what that ultimately means for one Gunnar Stockton there as well, but I expect him to be a factor in that quarterback position going forward. So our second topic here tonight, if you did not get a chance to watch Javon Bullard's interview that you can see up on our YouTube page on Thursday, I've got a story on Javon coming tomorrow morning. I was really impressed with what he had to say and how he represented himself and ultimately where his game is going into his 3rd season at the University of Georgia. This was a guy who was, being honest here, a complete afterthought when he was a recruit. He was the 2nd lowest ranked recruit in Georgia's 2021 recruiting class and came in impressed really early on, showed that he, at the very worst, can be a special teams player and pretty quickly factored into Georgia's secondary last year when William Poole was dismissed from the team. Bullard stepped right in and there was no drop off. And I think Bullard even got better, especially as he continued to play over the course of the season, and that culminated in the college football playoff, where he was the MVP of the Ohio State game from a defensive side of the ball, and then did it again in the national championship game. And it wasn't just, his all-around excellence, but he made really, really impactful plays. Had a sack in that Ohio State game, obviously had the big pass breakup on Marvin Harrison to prevent a touchdown there and limit Ohio State to a field goal. And then in the first half of the national championship game, 2 interceptions and a fumble recovery, and he only did that in a half, as he ended up having to leave the game with a shoulder injury. Bullard said his shoulder feels fine, and entering this third season, he's really looking to take that next step. And I think one of the more interesting questions with him is it at the star position? Is it at the safety position? Regardless of where Javon Bullard plays, he's going to be very, very important for this Georgia team this season. I think he's a guy who, as you saw over the course of last year, continued to get better and has really been tagged as a guy who I think is going to be a very important leader for this team this year. Like, he understands this. He said point blank, there's no replacing what Chris Smith brought to this team. He was a 3-year starter, a very respected leader and player within that locker room. And ultimately, Bullard is going to be tasked with filling those similar shoes. And I think he's a guy that is absolutely capable of doing so. He was asked about a bunch of different people, a bunch of different positions, and he spoke eloquently on all of them. And while, yes, I think the safety battle is the one most germane to him, I think he's someone who could certainly step in at that safety position. Georgia's going to cross-train across the secondary here in spring practice, and I think he's a guy who could naturally slide in at the safety spot. Maybe you move Smoke Bowie in at that star position. You've also got Tyke Smith there as well. So you've got options there in that secondary to where you can play Javon Bullard and get the most out of this group. And while Bullard ultimately isn't expected to be a cornerback, I think he knows and understands what the talent level is in that position. While, yes, they do have to go out and replace Keely Ringo, with the guys that they bring back in that secondary, I think Javon is right in expressing the confidence that he has in this position group and what they're ultimately going to be able to do as well. Yes, Keely Ringo is one of the better cornerbacks in college football last season, was an all-SEC level player. The guys behind him are plenty talented as well, and it starts with Kamari Lassiter.
Guys learning, eager to learn, man. Like I said, all this DB room, the team, period, we still eating off the floor. You can't really get complacent. Keely was a great player. Like I said, along with Chris, he did what he had to do here, man. Those guys are on the bigger and better things. But it's still next man up mentality, whether that's the safety position or the corner position. As far as like the corners, I know just off experience wise, Kamari is probably the leader of that group just based off experience. And I know he's going to continue to lead them in the right direction. So, like I said, I'm excited to see all of them just compete and go hard this spring.
So I really encourage you, if you've got some spare time, go watch the Javon Bullard interview we have on our DawgNation YouTube page. See him sort of talking through things. But he gave a great answer on how he finished last season and how he looks to carry that into the offseason, taking sort of every game, one game at a time, how he's feeling, how his shoulder is feeling, given he exited that national championship game and didn't get a chance to go in there and play in the second half despite desperately wanting to do so. He touched on what Smoke Bowie brings and why he likes what he's able to bring to this team, along with a good anecdote on Dominic Lovett there as well. So I thought Javon Bullard was really impressive when we got to hear from him this week, and is a guy that I think is going to play a very, very important role for this team entering the 2023 season. And why the secondary, well, yes, it does have to replace an All-American in Chris Smith and a really talented cornerback in Keely Ringo, who made perhaps the biggest play in program history with his interception of Bryce Young in the 2022 national championship game. The secondary is in great hands so long as Javon Bullard is back there at that star position. And so that's sort of our second topic here tonight, talking about Javon Bullard there. We talked about Sedrick Van Pran and the quarterback position off the top of the show there as well. Next up, let's talk offensive tackle. We like to talk about the offensive line here, give these guys their proper respect. And I think there's a lot of interest around this position. Obviously, Broderick Jones, Warren McClendon, 2 studs, 2 guys that are going on and I believe will play in the NFL. Basically every offensive tackle that has played for Georgia under Kirby Smart has gone on to the NFL, and more often than not, they tend to be really, really good players. You can look at Andrew Thomas, you can look at Jamari Sawyer. Obviously, Isaiah Wilson did not work out there, but Georgia has a strong track record of sending quality offensive tackles to the next level. I think Broderick Jones and Warren McClendon are going to be the next examples of that. And so now the question becomes, well, who replaces them? Well, I think the easy answer is one of those spots, it will be Amarius Mims. I think he's going to be Georgia's starting right tackle. I think they feel very comfortable keeping him there. I think when you see Amarius out there, the thing that just sticks out, and you see this in pictures, he is just so much bigger than everyone else. Even in a position group filled with guys who are 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", he towers over some of his teammates. And the fact that he has that kind of size mixed with the athleticism that he has. While, yes, you're hearing people question, Broderick Jones, he doesn't have a ton of experience and whatnot. And that might not be why he ends up being the first offensive tackle taken in this year's NFL draft. One, I absolutely believe Jones should be the first offensive tackle taken. And two, the upside with Mims in this game and what he can bring from a talent perspective is why he is going to be, I think, one of the better players on Georgia's team this coming season. And so you have that, and you know what you're getting there at that right tackle position. So what's that left tackle battle look like? And I think a lot of people are eager to see what Ernest Greene brings to the table. Both Broderick Jones and Warren McClendon gave Ernest Greene a lot of praise when they were speaking at their pro day workouts this week. They really liked what he came in and did last season from coming in the spring and how quickly he was able to pick things up. They both acknowledge Ernest Greene was farther along as a freshman than either of the two of them were. But Greene dealt with back injuries last season and kept him out during the course of the season. So entering spring, he is fully healthy, fully going through practice, was working with first-team offensive line. But there's another couple guys that are going to factor into this battle there as well. And Xavier Truss is a guy I didn't get asked about. I could totally see Georgia moving him to that left tackle spot and opening some things up at guard, given I do think they're a little bit better off at the guard position right now. But the two guys to really keep an eye on here in terms of pushing Greene and battling against him. One is Monroe Freeling, a freshman coming in, similar to where Greene was a year ago. He's the latest in a long line of hyped freshman offensive line recruits. And for as hyped as those guys are and as good as those guys have gone on to be in the course of their college career, Andrew Thomas is still really the only one that was able to consistently get on the field in his freshman season in a meaningful way. And so I think that's important to keep in context when discussing Monroe Freeling. Yes, he was a 5-star recruit, as was Broderick Jones, as was Isaiah Wilson. Ernest Greene was a top 50 overall recruit. Georgia has had great success signing elite offensive linemen, but that doesn't immediately translate to getting onto the field. And I think the big thing with Freeling going forward is, can he, get his weight and strength to where it needs to be to compete at an SEC level? There's a big difference between dominating at the South Carolina high school level from a physicality standpoint and being able to hold your own against the best pass rushers in the SEC. So, and that's going to be something that doesn't just continue through spring, but goes through the offseason as well. You see these guys come in. Broderick Jones is a great example of this. Was 285 pounds when he got to the University of Georgia. He is now up to 311 pounds. You have got to be able to put on and maintain strength and weight to play offensive tackle for Georgia and at this SEC level. The other guy, and the guy I think that has the best chance of being Georgia's starting left tackle when they open the season next year, is actually Austin Blaske. And Blaske is not a hype name recruit. He is a guy we quite frankly haven't talked enough about on this program. And is a guy who was a late addition to that 2020 signing class, but has bided his time as a guy that can play across the offensive line. He is the backup center right now, and a guy that can come in and play any of those 5 positions along the offensive line. He is Georgia's Swiss Army knife at that position, and the number 6 offensive lineman. I think he's got a great chance to potentially come in and start. I think you compare him to someone, you look at maybe someone like Warren Erickson, who started 14 games for Georgia during that 2021 national championship season. He's a guy who's not going to do anything wrong. He may not wow you physically. He may not be, the greatest athlete of all time, but he does what he's asked. He's incredibly coachable. He's a guy who knows what to do and isn't going to make a ton of mistakes. And ultimately, Georgia chose to go with Broderick Jones and ultimately move Jamari Sawyer to guard when they ultimately needed to in the national championship game. But I think Georgia feels very comfortable at what it has in Austin Blaske, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if he is able to beat out Ernest Greene, because as much as we've talked about Ernest Greene and praised, where he is in relation to, say, Broderick Jones and Warren McClendon were, Austin Blaske is 3 years older than him, and that physicality, that strength, he's played in SEC games before, he's taken reps with the ones at various points in his collegiate career. He is just farther along right now than Ernest Greene. And while Greene has plenty of runway to catch up to him, he's going to have to do that both in the spring practice and in the fall practice. And so it's going to be really interesting, I think, as this process unfolds. What happens with Monroe Freeling? How is he able to put on strength? How, if all, is he able to factor into this tackle position? And then ultimately, is Austin Blaske able to rely on his experience to keep him ahead of Ernest Greene, a very talented player and in his own right?
Yeah, Monroe, I don't know, I can tell you a lot more about him. We've only, had him for, I guess, maybe 8 weeks or whatever it is, 6 weeks. He didn't come in early during bowl practice and practice with us, but he's really done well in workouts. He's extremely flexible. He's tough. He can run. He's got great length. He's added some weight, but They hadn't seen the guy play football. Okay, so I can't go and say what he can and can't do. Now, Austin Blaske has played a lot of football. He's worked at tackle. He worked while Warren McClendon was out there for a while. He got a lot of reps at tackle. He competes at tackle. He's really athletic. He can flip over and play at center. So I've seen him and know he's a very viable candidate to compete for one of the starting jobs.
So, yeah, you hear Kirby Smart say it there himself. Blaske is absolutely a name to know at this offensive tackle position. While a lot of people are going to be interested in seeing what becomes of Ernest Greene, he's got to get back out there on the field and prove it and do so consistently. He had an awesome spring last season, and I'll be interested in seeing, especially as the expectations ramp up for him going into the 2023 season, if he's able to match that and do what he did a season ago. One last little nugget here before we move on to questions. Go ahead and start asking them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them. Obviously, NCAA tournament is going on. I know St. Mary's and UConn are in the second half right now. Baylor and Creighton have tipped off, and they're in the first half, maybe getting close to halftime. And then Fairleigh Ridiculous, as those from New Jersey like to call, will take on Florida Atlantic in a game that I don't think many people predicted would be played in the second round of the NCAA tournament. But a guy, don't forget about him. I know he's not flashy. I know we've talked about him a good bit here. Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint is going to make a good number of plays for Georgia this season. I don't have the video with me on hand, but he had a really impressive catch in Georgia's Pro Day workout with Stetson Bennett. And as a guy who, in thinking about him, and I'm sure we're going to get a chance to talk to him at some point this spring, well, yes, there's obviously a lot of attention on Dominic Lovett, on Ra Thomas, and what they bring in here. And I think a good number of people thought that Thomas would come in and start. I don't expect that to be the case. I think Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint is exactly what this offense needs. I think he's a guy who, well, yes, he's not the twitchiest sort of wide receiver like, say, A.D. Mitchell was. He's a guy who, similar to what we said about Austin Blaske and Warren Erickson a minute ago, he's not going to do anything wrong. He is not going to make a lot of mistakes. He's an incredible blocker. And I think as a guy that over the course of last season, as he continued to get more and more confidence and health in his ankle that he hurt against Florida back in the 2020 season, I think this is a guy who has continued to show that he can make big catches for you. Had a big touchdown catch in the win over Tennessee, has really strong hands, is really good at winning in tight windows. And I think his game may perhaps fit a little bit better with, say, either Carson Beck at that quarterback position than necessarily it did with Stetson Bennett. So I think the ability to win in tight spaces, I think what he brings from a blocking standpoint, I think this is a guy who, I'm not saying he's going to finish with 1,000 yards. I'm not even saying he's going to be Georgia's first leading receiver. I still think that's going to be Ladd McConkey. But I think this is a guy who, over the course of this upcoming season, he's going to come up with a couple of really big plays. And we don't talk about him a whole lot. He's entering his fourth year in the program. Yes, he was a one-time, I think, top 60 overall recruit. But he is a guy who's made big play after big play when Georgia has asked him to in his career. Obviously, he had the huge block in the national championship game on Brock Bowers' final touchdown there, had a big catch in the win over Ohio State, had a touchdown catch against Georgia Tech last season. This is a guy, when his number gets called, he usually comes through. And I have a feeling with what Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint is going to show this offseason, as he is one of the key leaders in the wide receiver position, I think he's a guy that is going to get asked to do a little bit more for this team this season, and I expect to see him follow through. Yes, Georgia does bring back its top two receivers last year in Brock Bowers, in Ladd McConkey, but there are a lot of receptions out there and yards to be had. Kenny McIntosh is gone. Darnell Washington is gone. Kyrus Jackson, Dominic Blaylock are gone. And I think Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint is an excellent candidate to soak up some of those catches and receptions and yards and key situations there. And I expect him to be a regular starter for the Bulldogs this year. And the guy, as we showed on Pro Day, I think is going to be a guy that is going to be able to make some big plays for Georgia over the course of the 2023 season. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and transition to the question and answer portion of the show tonight. Go ahead, ask away. I will not show you my bracket. We will not talk about that a whole lot here. Do your best to answer any sort of questions or thoughts you have here as well. Let's see. I see people are talking about Gonzaga basketball again here. Look, Gonzaga basketball, they're going to beat TCU tonight. I'm going to talk about them on Brandon's show on Tuesday when he asks, and we'll get there. And look, when Gonzaga is going to the Final Four once again and showing they're one of the better programs in college basketball, they're one seed in their bracket. Kansas lost to a really talented Arkansas team. Look, Gonzaga is going to be there in the end. And so I'm looking forward to talking about that. So thoughts, questions, comments not pertaining to Gonzaga basketball or Georgia basketball at all. Or not Georgia basketball, but college basketball in general. Let's keep it Georgia football related here. Let's see. Orange Shelley, yeah, this is a good comment about Michael Morris. Georgia brings back Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss, those guys are entrenched as starters here, but I think you have really good depth at that guard position. I'm interested in seeing the development of both Morris and Dylan Fairchild, two guys that signed in that 2021 recruiting class. Reality is they just have older guys ahead of them, but I do think that those are guys with multiple years of eligibility left that can come in and play and contribute to winning football for you. And Georgia's got really great depth on the offensive line there. Injuries weren't the biggest factor for this group last season. I know Mims missed some time. Warren McClendon missed a little bit of time there picking up an injury in the LSU game. But when you have guys like Amarius Mims coming off the bench, you have really great depth at that offensive line spot. And while, yes, they have to figure out that tackle spot, I think this Georgia offensive line is set up to have another really, really good season. Let's see. Wade Walford. Yeah, this is a good point. I haven't gotten a chance to write or talk a whole lot about Malachi Starks yet. I have a feeling we're going to hear from him at some point this spring. Georgia's in very good hands in their secondary, and I would include Kamari Lassiter as well. Obviously Malachi Starks, 5-star talent, superstar athlete, and things like that. But Lassiter and Bullard were not thought to be, super duper type players coming in right away. And those guys both, to their credit, have the right mindset that Georgia looks for in terms of what they want out of their players. And those guys are going to be multi-year starters, probably going to be All-American worthy candidates at the end of the day on their way to being NFL players. And I think that speaks to Georgia's ability to identify talent, not just guys who have the measurables that are capable of playing at the University of Georgia, but the mindset and the leadership abilities to help and contribute to this team. Countdown to G-Day. We're less than a month away. April 15th is when Georgia will have its G-Day scrimmage. A little bit later of a start time we learned this week, a 4 p.m. start. So Shadows will be coming in there at the end of that game. Not quite a night spring game, but it'll be broadcast on ESPN2. Should be a very interesting affair that day with a lot to learn. So let's see. Thoughts, questions, comments. Let's see. So Steve, this is a good question. We got a chance to see practice on Thursday. They actually had Smoke Bowie lining up and practicing with the cornerbacks. And while I don't expect that to be the ultimate position where he ends up playing, it speaks to his versatility and what Georgia is ultimately, I think, looking to get out of Bowie and what he might be able to do. I think his best chance in terms of getting onto the field is probably at the star position, and that would mean moving Javon Bullard to the safety spot. Now, Georgia's also got a lot of options at that safety position there as well. This spring, David Daniel-Sisvana has, I think, got an excellent opportunity to capitalize and find a way on the field there for himself. Janelle Aguero is a guy that a lot of people as a freshman are going to be interested in seeing. Ja'Cory Thomas has a year of experience under his belt there. So you've got a lot of options. Dan Jackson is a guy who's going to be coming back in the fall, and Georgia knows what it'll have in Dan Jackson when he takes the field there. So Georgia's going to be capable of moving some things around at that star and safety position, and maybe even Bowie could play that safety spot there as well for Georgia. So I think in terms of Smoke Bowie, look, his best attribute right now is his ability to move and play anywhere in the defense, and it wouldn't surprise me if he gets on the field in sort of a dime package role. But I think his best chance, the Texas A&M transfer in terms of getting on the field this year, is probably going to be at that star position. And I will note, if he had probably picked Georgia coming out of high school when he signed in the 2022 recruiting class, I think that there's a pretty good chance we're talking about him as a guy maybe best positioned to take over at that safety spot. But ultimately, he goes to Texas A&M, I think sets himself back a year and is ultimately trying really hard now to make up ground in that Georgia defensive backfield. Let's see. David West, so Alabama will not have their spring game televised nationally, but Colorado as well. And it speaks to Deion Sanders. And I'm going to be really interested in seeing what Sanders is able to do at Colorado this year. And we'll keep this brief. Look, he's a lot of talk right now. Look, that Colorado roster is bad. And I know he brought in a couple of transfers, and I know he's going to probably recruit pretty well, sign probably a top 15 class when all is said and done. We'll see how much his talk and bluster, what it is like when they're struggling to go 6-6, to put it mildly, in terms of the on-talent expectations they have there at the University of Colorado. So a lot of stuff out there. Barry Watkins, do I think Brock Vandagriff will transfer in May? If I had to make a prediction now, I don't think he does. I have a feeling that Brock wants to stick things out. I believe he is graduating in the fall, in December. And so his ability to get his graduate degree transferred potentially then. And look, having said all that, and knowing that I think there is the potential that Vandagriff could one day transfer, I don't expect it to be after the spring. Look, there's a world where, yeah, sure, Carson Beck wins the job, I think, as we all expect here. But what if he gets hurt and Brock Vandagriff comes in and plays really well? What if Carson Beck wins the job but doesn't necessarily look all that great against live action, as was the case with Dwan Mathis in 2020? There are a lot of variables now between now and when the season ends, and a ton of this stuff is going to twist, turn, and change. I'm sure there was a time when people thought Carson Beck was a transfer candidate there as well. And so you're obviously going to have to work and worry about that. I do think Kirby would be willing to go into the transfer portal just to get a body. They would probably have to know that they're going to be the third string quarterback in the event that Brock Vandagriff transfers there in that circumstance. And they're coming in to be behind Carson Beck and Gunnar Stockton there, because I think Gunnar is a guy that they have big plans for going forward. Let's see. Wade Wolford, is Kendall Milton 100% healthy right now? Yes, he is. We got a chance to hear from him on Tuesday. Thought about playing a clip from here tonight, but you can check out the video on our YouTube page there with talking with him. Look, he understands that he has to be able to stay healthy this season and prove to a lot of teams that he's able to do it. I was really impressed with how he came back and played the second half of last season. He looked really impressive, had a strong burst, and I think is a guy that if he's able to stay healthy this season, Georgia hasn't had a 1,000-yard rusher since the 2019 season when DeAndre Swift was a running back for Georgia. I think if Kendall Milton is able to stay healthy for 15 games, I think he has the talent and the ability with the offensive line in front of him to get to 1,000 yards. And so I am going to be interested in seeing what we see from Kendall, but Kendall doesn't have to answer any questions during spring practice in terms of his ability and what he can possibly bring to this team. I think he's an intriguing option. I think he's really talented. He led all SEC running backs in yards per carry last season. He's just got to be able to show durability to teams and to himself. He's able to get through a season and do what he's able to do over the course of a full 15-game season. If he does that, he's going to finish with over 1,000 yards, and it wouldn't surprise me if he does that he's a guy that we're talking about as an all SEC level of running back. Let's see. Thoughts, comments, questions. Let's see. Cole Spinner, I don't think that Branson is going to be the 1,000-yard rusher. He's got too many guys in front of him. Like I just talked about Kendall Milton there. I think Dejon Edwards is a guy who, similar to Elijah Holyfield in, say, the 2018 season, is a guy who's going to take a lot of carries and put in a lot of work. I think Branson is an interesting guy. I'll be interested in seeing what he does for Georgia this season. Could he get to 500-600 yards? I think so. As that third running back there, Andrew Paul is still working his way back from that ACL injury. Pretty close to 100%, not able to go through 11-on-11 drills. Georgia's being very cautious with him. He's expected to be fully ready to go and cleared for fall camp there. But I'll be interested in seeing, I think Branson Robinson, if we're making fictitious spring game MVP odds, I would have to think that Branson Robinson might be pretty high up there in terms of what he's able to do. Wallace Smith, I just answered your question on Andrew Paul there in terms of where things are going there. So let's see. Thoughts, maybe do one more comment or question before heading out here and getting back to college basketball. Let's see. String Gene, yeah, and this is a good point in terms of, seeing another 1,000-yard rusher. Mike Bobo got a lot out of Georgia running backs, and it wasn't just one kind. You can even think back to that 2014 season where, you start the year with Todd Gurley, who was, in my opinion, as special as anyone that I've seen in a Georgia uniform before his suspension and then ultimately tearing his ACL. In midseason, they had to switch to Nick Chubb, who is a different runner than Todd Gurley is, and still find a way to be extremely successful, finish with over, I believe, 1,400, maybe even 1,500 rushing yards that season. And so I'll be really interested in seeing what Mike Bobo does with this running game and what they're able to do out there. Some rapid fire questions. William Camacho, yes, Javon Bullard is close to 100% healthy. Just said he needed rest after the national championship game and said he had got it there. Brian McPhail asked who will be Georgia's third tight end option. Obviously, number one is Brock Bowers. Number two is going to be Oscar Delp, and I'll be interested in seeing what we see out of him this year. Number three, right now I'm going to go Lawson Lucky, a guy I think is just slightly ahead of Pierce Spurlin. Spurlin missed a chunk of his senior season, came back, played well at the the All-American Bowl there in San Antonio. But Lawson Lucky was a guy that came in, practice with the team during bowl prep. It's a guy who is a little bit ahead right now of what Pierce Spurlin is able to bring. And while I think Spurlin has nice upside as a receiver, I think Lawson Lucky is also a little bit more polished as a blocker and might be able to better help in that aspect. And so in that way, I think you see him maybe get on the field more. But I don't expect necessarily as many 12 personnel, 2 tight end sets from Georgia this year. simply because, well, yes, Oscar Delp is a weapon that can be used, and I do expect Georgia to do that at certain times during the course of the season. He's not the blocker that Darnell Washington is, and I don't expect them to be as sort of run heavy from 12 personnel maybe as they were in years past. I do think perhaps they'd be more willing to throw out of 12 personnel with what Delp and Brock Bowers can bring to you in that position there. So let's see. Thoughts, maybe the one. You guys have been fantastic tonight, by the way, as well. Yeah, Greg Child, this is a good point. Women's softball, I believe, swept Texas A&M this weekend, and Georgia women's basketball wrapped up their season today. Tough loss on the road to Iowa, but I think, again, this is a team. Future looks bright there for them. They've obviously got to do some work in the portal, bringing in more talent as the SEC. Look, they've got, I think, the best team in the country in South Carolina. LSU is going to be a formidable opponent for years to come. But I think Georgia basketball, look, they know what they have to do to get to the next level. Joni Taylor moving on after last season. Next year, in the near future, the goal is ultimately going to be to get to that Sweet 16. They did a great job, I think, in year one, getting the second round of the NCAA tournament. Played a really good Iowa team that has the best player in the country in Caitlin Clark. How do they go about building off of it going into next season? So a little bit of women's basketball talk for you. Plenty of spring football coverage, not just this past week, but this upcoming week there as well. We'll look to hear from more, maybe potentially Kirby Smart this week. Definitely some players. Hopefully we get a chance to get out there and see more practice as we did this past week. I'll have a story on Javon Bullard tomorrow. I'll have a story on the quarterback position, battle and updates there as well. Plenty of stuff coming in the days ahead. You've obviously got Brandon Adams Monday through Friday on DawgNation Daily. You've got Mike Griffith on the beat Monday night. Jeff Sintel before the hedges on Wednesday, where he's going to play part 2 of a great interview with Nolan Smith there as well. So plenty of Georgia football coverage and content coming up over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, spring practice, week 1 is in the books. They've got 3 practices down. They've got another 12 to wrap up, concluding with G-Day on April 15th. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. This is, as always, a treat on Sunday night. We'll be back here next Sunday talking Georgia football. I'm sure there'll be more twists and turns in the week up ahead, but thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, we'll be back here Sunday night, 7:30 as usual. My name is Connor Riley. This has been another episode of Connor in Coverage as I scramble to find our closing graphic here. You're seeing me produce live and some of the issues with that. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, we enjoyed doing this. Hopefully I answered some questions there and got to learn a little bit more about Georgia football. Lovely.